Okay, so as the year starts to wrap up, I'll give you a couple more just lectures, go over some more material. Unit 4 is a lot about individual citizenship and individual responsibility. Unit 3 still has some aspects of governance. We're going to look at democracy and how that works. There's no fill in the blank for this, but if you hear something interesting or just something sticks out to you, just write that down in the notes beside you. Okay, in this PowerPoint package, you will review political systems, democracy, consider questions, what is the difference between representative and direct democracy? What are the characteristics of representative democracy and who is government responsible to? Okay. So some of this information might come in handy for a variety of your diploma questions. Might just help you to think differently about the subject as well. Okay, so in a democracy, decisions are made by the majority with respect for minority rights. So we just had the Alberta provincial election for our premier. The UCP won by a small majority, if I understand correctly, but still a majority. They still had more than 50% of the votes, or seats rather. A lot of people are unhappy about that, but that is how a democracy works. Even though it wasn't a huge victory, it was still a victory, right? And so now that is the government in charge. There is a free and open competition for, I wouldn't use the word power, I would rather use for governance, right? Influence. Okay, some people might conflate that with power, but it's not quite the same thing. Obviously, power is being able to twist people's arm and force them to do things, which is also malicious, right? But if you have a compelling argument, you're very good at representing your ideas and convincing people. You're just competent in conveying ideas. Okay. Those who are elected are accountable to the voters, allegedly, right? So that's how generally democracies work. Here's a quote by Winston Churchill. It says, "It has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time." Right? So obviously people are very unhappy with democracy at times. They don't like the way it works, but it so far certainly has proven to work better than communism, dictatorships through that, or fascist dictatorships as well. Any kind of extreme form of governance where people do not have freedoms and people are not allowed to speak freely, act freely, vote freely. So some of the conditions of democracy: you have popular sovereignty, so rule by the people. This requires periodic elections. In Canada, we have federal elections every 5 years. I can't remember right now if that also applies for provincial. The government may call them more frequently, but this is depending on their popularity with the citizens. So Justin Trudeau called an election pretty early. He called one during the pandemic, ironically. A lot of people commented, they said apparently, their thoughts were that he did that to get a majority government, to get more seats than he already had. And that kind of backfired on him. Right, they have a minority government and they're reliant upon the NDP at the federal level to help them make decisions and policy changes. Okay. In the USA, elections are held every 4 years.
Hold on. Canada, 5 years though. Recently, it has always been 4.
I believe they have up to 5 years maximum. So in the 5th year, you have to. So in the 4th year, they can choose to, but in the 5th year, they have to.
Really?
Yeah. Right, but they can also call one 2 years in if they want to get more seats. 3 years, 1 year, right? It wouldn't really be smart to call one 1 year after you win. Unless you had a really weak government and you did some awesome things and you thought maybe more people are going to vote for you, right?
Quebec did that, I believe.
So elections must be free from intimidation and bribery. With this recent election, I think people were raising the concern. They thought that, some of the UCP voters will be out by voting stations and they're going to be having an intimidating presence, trying to make sure that the UCP wins. I don't think any of that actually happened. I didn't see a single news report. Not that I watch the news or look for these reports. I didn't see anything.
Did you vote?
We'll get to that.
Do attack ads even work?
Okay. Anyway, what's up?
Do attack ads even work?
I'm sure they work on some people.
Right.
Anyways, everyone has the right to vote. This is franchisement or franchise. Right, so once you're 18 and older, citizen of Canada, it doesn't matter if you're working or not. Right, as long as you're a citizen, doesn't matter if you own property or not, doesn't matter if you're male or female, black, white, orange, blue, purple. But it does matter if you have, I think in Canada, it still matters if you have a criminal record. And then obviously, if you're under the age of 18, you can't vote. Okay. Everyone's allowed to run for office. This is how democracies work. So, in a democracy, you also have independent judiciary. So, this judiciary systems are the court systems. Okay, so court systems and judges are beyond the control of the government, as they are often called upon to make decisions that go against the government. This requires the rule of law. All people are equal under the law. The rule of law is a liberal, classical liberal idea, or generally speaking, liberal idea. Okay. Additionally, in democracy, the raising and spending of all money must originate with the elected representatives of the people. Okay, so someone in the parliament has to either raise some sort of request in the parliament to increase taxes or spend taxes, right? And it doesn't just happen by, the prime minister just decides tomorrow we're going to allocate all our tax money over here or there. Okay. You also have political parties, so a collection of like-minded people who wish to form the government. They provide the people with choice and ensure their wishes are met through the competitive election process. So hypothetically, you and your buddies, whether it's a prank or legitimate, you could get together, you could form your own political party, and in the next election for Leduc, you could run, one of you could run to be mayor, or you could have a political party that runs in Alberta, try to get voted into the parliament in Alberta, potentially become the premier if that interests you. Democracies also have interest groups, so these are lobby groups. They advocate for their own specific interests. Some of you might have heard of this one, the MADD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. So as the title would suggest, they are against drunk driving. They advocate for a variety of issues related to drunk driving. So it could be increased sentences for people who cause let's say death due to their decision to drink and drive. It could be education. I don't know if have you kids ever gotten a presentation from Mothers Against Drunk Driving? Okay, I remember
I think we had a lesson about drunk driving back in grade 9, pre-pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. So way back in the day, like I remember my brother was 5 years older than me. So this would have been almost like 18 years ago, I don't know. They used to bring in MADD and they'd come give a presentation. They also had one for drugs and whatnot. Basically, they get a group of people to come in to like an elementary classroom and tell them how terrible drugs are and how drinking and driving is terrible, and get them while they're young, right? One thing with interest groups, lobby groups, is just challenging. Sometimes they can have a lot of influence on a government. Sometimes there can be a lot of money involved with them as well. Okay. Particularly, let's say if a lobby group is backed by a corporation or an industry, and they're constantly advocating, campaigning to the government to make certain changes, let's say on their industry's behalf, it can get very dicey. They have that issue a lot in America. Free press is very, 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 very crucial to a democracy or to any political system for it to function well, let's be honest, right? You cannot limit and restrict the people who are giving you news, information, who are reporting on what the government is up to. Right? Like honesty is the primary policy to help anything function well, whether it's a relationship, whether it's a, something at work, government, friendship. If you have someone who's always lying to you, it's very hard to, have a proper relationship with that individual. And the same goes at the government level. So if the government's just hiding what they're up to, not being transparent, right? They talk about transparency in government. Every now and then, a scandal will come out like, oh, the government officials went to this meeting over in this country and they bought hotel rooms that were from like $900 to $3,000 a night. They flew first class, they ate lobster and caviar and all this stuff, and they did it all on taxpayer dollars. So having the transparency, knowing that this is what the government's spending, part of that comes from free press, right? The politicians can't interfere and threaten their careers or livelihoods. Additionally, though, the government can't, I think this is a problem with the CBC, or has been noted as a problem with the CBC, that, if they're funded by the government, does that mean that they're not going to write critically about that same government, right? Particularly if a government comes into power and gives them a whole bunch of extra money or increased power, influence, and control, it becomes very challenging. Dictatorships make sure that they control the press. Hitler was very good at this. He had a guy, his name was Joseph Goebbels, something like that, Goebbels, who was his minister of, what do they call it? Propaganda, right? I want to say the Russians, the communists, had propaganda as well. They had people who were experts at making it, producing it, and selling it to the people. Okay, so obviously a modern concern is that media has more power. Some people criticize the media. They say it's the fourth branch of the government. Or you have the judicial, there's 3 other levels that are escaping my mind right now. That's terrible. Obviously you have the court systems, you have the federal government, the provincial governments. Some people think that the media is another branch of that government, and they just do the government's bidding, essentially. Right? It can be very challenging. Okay. Okay, constitutional monarchy is a political system in which there is a king and queen who must follow the rules of a constitution. This is a bit of an older system. They don't really have a lot of monarchies that are legit anymore, where the king or queen makes all the decisions. Potentially the only place is Saudi Arabia. Constitution is a set of rules that the government and the people of a country must follow. But there's a relationship between the people who set the rules and the people in charge who confirm or validate and follow the rules. The Magna Carta is at the back of the room. Is very hard to read, or a copy of the Magna Carta, which is a constitutional limitation on the King of England, kind of the birth of a lot of modern laws. Okay, this is just kind of repeating stuff. 2 basic types of democracy: of direct democracy, so people vote on every issue, a referendum, anytime the government wants to do something. So let's say anytime I want to do something in a classroom with direct democracy, we always take a vote, and we go based on that vote. Okay. Now that works fine when there's about 30 of you or 20 of you, because it's very easy to hear everyone out, you're all gathered in one spot. But what if you have 2,000 people, 2 million, right? People are busy, they don't always vote, right? So it is challenging. You have representative democracy, where people vote for a person to represent them in government. These representatives vote for the people's wishes in government. So ideally you have a candidate who you adhere to a lot of their beliefs or what they're espousing, or political party, and you vote for those group of people to represent you in different levels of government. Okay, and that's your constituency. The number of federal constituencies has gone up. That is because Canadian population keeps rising, or as the population fluctuates, you need to change those constituencies to be more representative of the places that they're from, right? So if Alberta all of a sudden gets 3 million extra people, you need to carry that, you need to take that into account for political decision making. I think we're at 32 or 33 now. I was just quickly checking. Federal constituencies. One representative for each of these constituencies. These representatives go off to Ottawa, where our federal parliament takes place, which is representation by population. The more people in a region, the more representatives in Ottawa. Okay. Which can make it challenging, because then right now, I just did the calculations before class, something like 54% of seats are from Ontario and Quebec. Right, so those two provinces decide to vote a particular way in the federal election. It doesn't matter what the rest of Canada thinks or feels or wants, right? So that can be kind of challenging as well. Okay. So problems with democracy. You have voter apathy, right? Many voters do not participate for a number of reasons. You just think of the word apathetic. When someone feels apathetic, they're a little unwilling, they don't want to, they have no desire to do things. And the 5 reasons presented, so lack of understanding of the issues. Some people might just not feel like they know what's going on enough to vote. The idea that they cannot make a difference, feel like your vote doesn't count. The idea that all politicians are corrupt. Inability to communicate in English or French, that can also be a challenge, right? I'm sure some people's parents, they don't speak English well enough and don't feel comfortable. Poverty can, to some extent, play a role in not voting. Some of the problems within a democracy can be the tyranny of the majority. So that definitely played a role during, did you guys check in at the office?
Yeah.
Okay. So tyranny of the majority definitely played a role during the COVID pandemic, where you had about 75 to 90% of the population that was vaccinated, that more or less was being told by the government to be very upset at the last 10 to 25% of people who weren't getting vaccinated for continuing to cause the problem and carry it forward. Many people thought that, hey, we should force vaccinations onto these people. We should force their decisions, their ideology onto another group of people, right? And you kind of want to protect, that's why you have minority rights. You want to be able to protect people against the majority, right? Like, you're still an autonomous individual. You should be allowed to make your own choices. It doesn't matter if 90% of the people are going another way or not, right? Okay. And so finding ways to protect the minority group of people who don't get what they want in a voting situation, right? It can be very complicated. Like, how do you protect them? Are they still free? We have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms to help protect people, but trouble with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is that if the Canadian, you got signed in as well?
Yeah, I did.
Okay. The problem with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is that the first clause essentially states that if the government, and the court systems more or less, if they decide that they can limit and restrict your rights, then you don't have those rights anymore. Which can present a problem, right? Because then how do you protect that minority of people who disagree if the government makes that choice? Okay, lobby groups, we already talked about how they can produce a problem. Okay, bureaucracy can be a problem in democratic systems. What this is referring to is essentially, Was anyone in this class part of the group of students who helped get the dance, do you think? A little bit.
Yeah.
So let's say for that group of grade 12s who got the dance to go through, they basically had to talk to Mr. Heck, Miss Rantucci. You know, that was the limitations of their bureaucracy that they had to deal with, which isn't much, right? It's 1 or 2 people, really only 1. But imagine if they had to talk to Mr. Heck, they had to go to the superintendent, vice superintendent, they had to get 10 teachers, ask another principal, right? That's what they say with bureaucracy, right? Just to go through all these hula hoops to get what you want, right? And let's say it's a simple thing. So I'm reading a book right now by a guy named Hernando de Soto called The Mystery of Capital, but they talk about how in some countries it's very difficult to own a house or a piece of land. Like in some of the countries that they're examining, it was 200 steps over a 10-year process just to own a house. So you had to go to some sort of government official, representative, not necessarily like a person who gets voted in. You have to go somewhere, you know, get a stamp from one person, and you take that document, you go to another person, you get some other approval, and you go here, you do that 200 times over 10 years, in some of the more extreme cases. Right? That's bureaucracy, it gets in the way of problem solving. It's one of my issues with my profession sometimes. Okay. Okay, votes of non-confidence. So let's say if the federal, I believe this is how it works more or less. If the federal government in charge puts forward a vote and it's voted against them, you can put in a vote of non-confidence that this government's not capable of governing the country, doesn't have enough of the people behind them. Which would cause a re-election. Okay, now I don't fully understand the vote of non-confidence situation, so there's still a lot of learning there left for me to do as well. But members of parliament who do not vote with their party are usually kicked out, right? That's party solidarity. You know, if you're on the team and you score on your own net repeatedly, you know, eventually either you're gonna get kicked off the team or the team's gonna beat you up, right? For that reason, members of parliament are almost always vote according to the wishes of their party. And that kind of makes sense. You know, if you're fully aligned with that party's belief, if you're fully aligned with your team's values and beliefs and what they're up to, it makes sense that you do what they do. Right? You shouldn't necessarily have to be forced to do it. You should want to do it because it's your belief system as well. Because of this, the wishes of the MP's constituents are often ignored, leads people to believe that Canada elects a dictator every 5 years. Right? So it can be complicated as the levels of government go up. Another problem often in democracies is mainly the rich and educated who participate in politics, meaning running for government, or actively influence the government system. So with interests or lobby groups, as a result, these elite groups tend to get what they want. I'm not sure that's a really good criticism. You know, again, anybody is free to run for the government. A friend of mine actually ran for the vote in Edmonton. I don't think he got any votes, but he thought, hey, I'll give it a try, why not, right? He kind of did it from a religious perspective. He thought that people from our religious community should be running more, and so he decided to pioneer the way and figure that out, which is very interesting, you know, well worth the try, why not? But anybody's allowed to do it. This criticism doesn't take into account that people have different strengths and weaknesses, right? So my friend who ran for this position is what you might call a quick start. You know, he doesn't care about finding all the facts like myself. He's maybe more entrepreneurial, which explains why he's onto his 3rd business. That he started and run, but didn't have anyone to leave behind to run it for him. You know, so that's one of his skill sets, one of his strengths. He just starts things. He doesn't need all the details and information. He's like, you know what, I'll figure it out on the way. And maybe running for government suits people like that more than it does, just leave it on my desk, people who want all the facts and details, who want everything put together before they decide to do something. we'll watch this after. We got one more slide. That's it. Yeah, here are the terms from this PowerPoint. Just make sure you look those over.